Today I want to talk to you a little bit about game genres and two other terms I'm going to use, mood and mode. So today when we're talking about genre and classifying games, the purpose of this is so that we can try to make better games or to understand what we're making a bit better so that we can do a better job as game developers. It's about thinking about the categories we use and whether they are helpful to us as designers. And the approach that I'm going to show you today is aimed at trying to help you to avoid some really common pitfalls that I see developers get into. One of those is genre mashups that are unsuccessful because the things don't fit together or they can't make them fit together. The second one is prematurely adding a lot of content and systems that your game doesn't need because you've set out to make a particular type of game and you assume that it needs certain things in it. So you start with them and perhaps they weren't the best things to start with when you're in the early stages of making your game. And thirdly, a really common issue is starting a game that you're not really equipped to make at the moment based on your current skills in art and technology. All of these are really common issues that I see on this channel. And you might be thinking, what qualifies this guy to tell me all of this? You know, I've worked as a game designer professionally for a decade. I've taught design to university students, and I like to think that's kind of what I do here on YouTube as well. The content I produce is aimed at that level. It's aimed at adults who already know a fair bit about game design and want to learn more. Most importantly, for the purpose of this video, is that I've reviewed more than 80 of your games in the last 10 months. So in the under a year that this channel has been running, you have sent me dozens and dozens of your games and I've reviewed them. And some of the issues that I'm talking about in this video come from my observations about the games that I've played while making this channel. So when we think about genre and what it's for, we often think of it in terms of consumers trying to identify the things they like. So you go into a bookshop and you know you like horror, and because horror is a recognized category of books, they can have a horror section and you can go over there and find what you want in the horror section, right? On Steam, we have tags, which are a lot broader than the concept of genre. And if I look at this list of tags, I would say 3D platformer to me, that reads as a game genre, but these other things are something else. They're different types of categorization of games. But in order to have a helpful conversation about genre, we have to understand why we're doing it. And as I said, this is a channel for game designers. And as a game designer, when you have questions and thoughts about genre, they are going to be maybe different from the kinds of questions and thoughts that a gamer might have. When gamers have debates about game genres, they're often doing it as a sort of fun intellectual exercise. If you go on a forum for roguelikes, there will be people having these kind of fun philosophical debates or arguments about what is or isn't a roguelike and so on. And the stakes of that for them are maybe winning an argument, maybe arguing for argument's sake. And that is not really what we're interested in doing here. We're not interested in the concept of genre so that we can say strictly, this is this type of game. That might be a helpful thing to do, but as developers, we have other concerns. Maybe looking at the type of game we're trying to make and understanding other games in the same category so that we can say, how does this game work? Because I want to do as well as that popular game. I want to do better than that game. I want to understand, you know, what people expect from this genre, what the problems with the genre are, and how I can fix it. We have a different set of concerns to the average gamer. And we might share some concerns, but that's because developers are gamers and generally we pick genres to make that we like playing. So of course there is some overlap. Point is that this is not a video that is interested in having one of those kind of forum conversations about strictly putting things in pigeonhole boxes like a paleontologist would do with dinosaur bones. What we're trying to do here is identify some common issues that game developers have with the concept of genre, which often lead to them making games which don't do as well as they thought they would. Most of you will have heard this etymology before. Genre comes from genus, which is a Latin word meaning a category or type of things that are the same in some way. And nowadays we tend to use genre for a category of media. So hip hop is a genre of music, Western is a genre of movie, and so on. In film studies, we've had people theorizing about this for decades. So Rick Altman gave us these top two types of genre. So a semantic genre is a genre of film where we can identify it by seeing the things in the film. We see the characters, what they're wearing, where the film is set, and we say, oh, that's a Western because it's in a desert and someone's wearing a cowboy hat. So that would be a semantic genre, a genre that is defined by its individual parts that you can see. And then in Altman's model, you've got syntactic genres, genres that are defined by the shape of the story, what's happening in the story and what the story is about. So something like a mystery would be an example of a syntactic genre because it is defined by its structure rather than its iconography. But eventually Altman gave in and introduced this third category called pragmatic genres, which basically means that genres are whatever fans and critics say they are, which kind of brings us back to the idea of fans debating things on forums because they enjoy it. This is a sort of I'll know it when I see it approach to genre. And when you think of the ways that we classify games, you could think of a category like cozy as being something like this. There isn't really a clear structural definition of what makes a cozy game. There's elements of both of these. Really it is something that is kind of, it's cozy because people that like cozy games say it's a cozy game type thing. In literature studies, we get genre, which is what we were talking about before, you know, things like fantasy, horror, western, that are to do with what the story is loosely about and the things it contains. And then we have this other concept of mode, which is more like the structure of the story, how the story is told to us and framed. It's much broader than the genre. So something like realism or magical realism or social realism are examples of modes. Something like satire is a mode. Now, these two terms are used quite differently by different literary theorists, and I don't want to get into too much detail about that now. But the point is that I'm going to be using this concept of mode to help us come up with better classifications for games where we're not thinking of every different type of game as being a different genre. So just to give you another example of genre and mode, here we have Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a horror novel. Most of us know that even if we've never read it. That is the genre that it fits in, and we can tell that from like films that have been made of it and so on. But the thing that is different about this book that you perhaps don't get when you watch a film of Dracula is that it is in the mode of an epistolary novel. Now, if you've never heard that term, it's another word for a book of letters, a story that is constructed from documents by characters who are sending each other letters and so on. It's a different format for telling a story. So again, we could have the story of everything that happens in Dracula, all of this gothic horror genre stuff of vampires and spooky castles and so on. And we could have it in a different mode. We could make it into a fake documentary movie or so on. The medium is the book. The genre is the type of book it is in terms of its contents and what it's about. And then the mode is the kind of type of book it is in terms of how the story is framed and presented to us. And a more recent example of a book that uses a similar combination of genre and mode is World War Z, which is a zombie book, but it is written as a series of documents or reports from the UN following a zombie apocalypse. Same sort of combination of things going on there as in Dracula. Now, another way of explaining this difference, perhaps a bit of a strange one, is if you go to have Mexican food, Mexican is like the genre of the food, is the type of food that you are getting. And regardless of whether I go to the Mexican restaurant or the taco truck, I am getting Mexican food. It's the same genre of food. But the way that the food is kind of presented to me and delivered to me is the mode. And in this case, the mode is a taco truck and I eat it on the side of the street. And in this case, it's sat down in a restaurant. The point I'm really trying to get to here is that genre is not the only way of classifying media. And the more ways that you have of classifying media, the better you can understand sort of nuances between different types of things. Like then you can understand that Dracula is a horror novel, but it's also another type of novel. And these things are working together in a particular way. So this brings us on to the idea of mode in video games and how and why is this distinction useful for developers. Now, I have not come across the idea of genre versus mode being used in video games in the way I'm going to use it today. And that's not me trying to brag and say I came up with a theory. If you read any designers talk about this before and they've used a similar distinction, then by all means, please leave a comment. But again, the point here is to try and avoid some common pitfalls that designers have when they're trying to think about what type of game they're making, and they're thinking that they've got the genre of their game nailed down, and they haven't really. What they've got is a mode or a mood. So for the purpose of this video, I want to define a game genre as something which tells us what the player is doing moment to moment. A game genre usually tells us something about the 3 C's of the game: the character, the camera, and the controls. How am I controlling the game? How is the camera positioned? And like, who am I controlling if I'm controlling a person, or am I controlling lots of people? You can already start to think of how real-time strategy and platformer, those terms, they already put a picture in your mind as a gamer of where the camera is in this game. Where is the camera angled? Am I controlling a character? What kind of controls am I using, right? Real-time strategy, I'm controlling all of these little characters and buildings from a camera placed above using a mouse and a keyboard. Unless you're a sicko like me who played the entirety of Command & Conquer 1 on a PlayStation because you're an absolute legend. But mostly a real-time strategy game is a point-and-click game. A platformer, you're thinking of controlling a little character jumping around and you're looking at them from the side. And I know some of you Hollow Knight fans are going to see this and say,
Hollow Knight's not a platformer, it's a Metroidvania.
That is kind of leading into something we're going to get onto in a minute, but I would say it is still a platformer, but Metroidvania is a type of platformer that it is. So a game genre is usually going to tell us what the player is doing moment to moment in the game, and it's going to tell us about these 3 C's of character, camera, and controls. And 3 C's is an industry term for this particular type of design focus on the camera and how characters move and how the game controls. In bigger AAA game studios, you get game designers where this is their whole job and they don't touch level design or systems or economies or anything like that. Now, what I'm going to be arguing is that if you're using a game genre to guide your design and you're saying what I'm making is a card battler or what I'm making is a cozy farming game, whatever you describe your game as is going to inform your game design, because it's going to give you ideas about what you should make based on what fans of that genre expect. But some of the things that we tend to call genres do not do all of this stuff. They don't tell us about the moment-to-moment gameplay. They don't tell us how the game is supposed to control, what characters are supposed to involve, how they're supposed to move around, and so on. And this can be an issue because it generates some of those problems that I talked about right at the start of this video. I'm going to argue that it's not helpful for game designers to think of genre in terms of the mood of their game, like cozy or horror, or the mode of their game, which is things like roguelike, Metroidvania, and deck builder. And we'll get into why I consider these modes in a minute. Now, I want you to imagine that this pyramid represents the 3 important parts of a game, and they're sort of color-coded here. Now, the core mechanics of what you're doing in the game are the bottom of the pyramid. These help define what the player is doing over and over again in the game. And they are the foundation of the pyramid, because if people don't enjoy the main activity that they're doing over and over again, then the rest of the pyramid falls down, right? The next step up the pyramid are things like your progression mechanics. So what are you collecting? What are you upgrading? What are you investing your time in by playing this game? And these progression mechanics are important because they give you a reason to do things. Why am I doing these things? What is the reward? What is the investment? But again, this part of the pyramid cannot stand up if the bottom part is not in place. So if the bottom part is not fun, or it doesn't appeal to people, or people just don't enjoy doing that core activity over and over again, they're not going to care about this next tier up. They're not going to care about getting rewards or investing points or currency into things, right? So this sits on top of the core mechanics. And then right at the top, we've got all of the stuff is kind of vibes. We've got the aesthetic, the theme, and the mood. And it's important. It could be like the deciding factor in whether someone buys one game or someone prefers one game over another. But again, a game is an activity. A game is a set of things that you do over and over again. So having a strong aesthetic, having a good, interesting mood or theme for your game is not going to save a game where the bottom and middle of the pyramid are not strong. And you will notice at the bottom of each of these chunks, I've added one of the 3 words that this video is about: genre, mode, and mood. Now, if we go from my strict definition of genre from earlier, where it needs to be something that tells us what the player is doing moment to moment, then genre is where we get our core mechanics, right? So a platformer is a genre, and the core mechanics are things like jumping, or breaking things in the environment, or jumping on enemies to defeat them. Those are core mechanics that come out of the genre. Now, if we take Hollow Knight as an example, The genre of platformer is where we get the jumping and the kind of side view fighting and so on. And that's what makes Hollow Knight a platformer. And that's what contributes to enjoying playing 30 seconds or a minute of Hollow Knight. Now, once we've got those core mechanics that people enjoy, then people might want to explore a world. They might want to upgrade things or find secrets. And that's when we move into the next stage of the pyramid, the progression mechanics, which here I'm referring to as the mode. If we take Hollow Knight as an example again, the mode is it's a Metroidvania and it's a Souls-like, right? Those two terms don't do enough to tell you what the player is doing moment to moment. You can guess from the term Metroidvania that it's also going to be a platformer, but, you know, saying a game is a Souls-like, well, you know, the original Souls games are 3D brawlers. I've seen Souls-likes that are card games. Souls-like is a mode because it doesn't tell us about the core mechanics. It's not a genre, it's a mode. So in this case, I would put Souls-like and Metroidvania in the purple category. They're in the middle. They define why players are doing things, what the rewards are, what the kind of longer term goals of the game are. If the Souls-like Metroidvania stuff doesn't work, then you don't care if it looks pretty. And if the core mechanics, that kind of 30 seconds of fun of the game of jumping around and fighting doesn't work, then you don't care that it's a Souls-like or a Metroidvania. These things stack on top of each other. If you're a game developer and you don't nail this core stuff of how it feels to do the basic activity that you're doing over and over again in your game, and you invest a lot of time in these other two things, there is a good chance that you are wasting time and throwing away more work than you need to. So if you're designing a game and you start with mood, you start at the top of the triangle, you are going to maybe spend a lot of time in limbo, confused about what the structure of your game is, how players are supposed to progress, but more importantly, you're not going to know what your core mechanics are, what's fun about your game, and so on. And I see this happen a lot because we have a lot of game developers decide that they want to make a cozy game or decide that they want to make a horror game, and they don't really know what is meant to be fun in that game moment to moment. So they've started with an aesthetic, so how the game looks and how it's supposed to make people feel. And of course, if you're smart and you really study cozy games or you really study horror games, you study the best in genre, you can kind of learn from studying them what kind of game structures that they have that make them work, that make them feel cozy or make them feel scary. And you can sort of study what kind of core mechanics they have. But if you're thinking about the practical process of making a game, if you haven't worked out what is fun about moving the character around, about the way the camera controls, about the basic activities that you do every minute of the game, you could spend a long time putting blood on walls or making beautiful flowers sway in the wind, and you're not going to get that time back. And that means that if you then later on try and make these more integral parts of your game that are the parts that actually make it a game, and you've already spent loads of time making beautiful art, you're going to be too attached to it to see that it's bad, and often you're going to just end up having done a lot more work that you need to throw away when eventually you realize the project is not going anywhere. Now, I'm not saying you should start developing a game with no sense of what the theme is. Some people are mechanics first designers and they can design mechanics in a total abstract way and add a theme later. Some people say, I want to make a game about X, and they start with the theme and then they work out mechanics that go with it. What you shouldn't be doing is spending ages up here and sort of delaying working out what your core mechanics are. You need to work out what they are early, even if you have an idea for what you want the end sort of mood, theme, and aesthetic of the game to be. Now, there are some success stories of people accidentally making a cozy game. A good example of this I saw recently, Advanced 9, the developer of Nightstones, put up this video called How to Accidentally Make a Cozy Game, where he basically tells the story of developing this cute open world game where he never necessarily intended it to be a cozy game because he wasn't aware of that as a type of game. When he started showing it to people, people were saying, oh, this is cozy. So then he kind of learned more about that market and learned more about what they want from a game and then pivoted the game towards that. So this is an example of, you know, designing the core gameplay of the game and then finding the mood of the game as you go along. Now, this is a bit of an extreme example, but to be honest, I've seen it enough times that I'm now worried every time someone tells me their game is a roguelike. And what they really mean is that something in the game is randomized, and that is supposed to increase the possible playtime because of novelty of it being different. And then you look at the game and it's something like this. And you think, well, yeah, you've got a structure for your game. You've got some sort of progression mechanics of, you know, playing through randomized levels and collecting things or something. But the basic thing that you're doing here is not appealing and wouldn't be appealing to the majority of players of indie games because it's too simple. What I'm really trying to get you to think of with this pyramid model here is that designing a game is creating an activity for someone. You are giving people something to do, and the thing that they are doing needs to be compelling enough that they want to do it over and over again. And in some games, they are basically collections of mini games. So if we think back to the example of cozy games, often we get a set of mechanics where none of them is super challenging or interesting on its own, but you put together, you know, planting crops and fishing and lots of little mini games about managing different things. And then the kind of meta game of working out how to manage all these things and find enough hours in the day, that becomes the game. But in order to have enough activities to kind of create that interesting tension between, do I do this today or do I do this? What can I fit into my day? You need to have the set of mechanics in place in the first place, or you at least need to have a good idea of what they're going to be, because designing a game is creating an activity for people to do. Maybe you're building a world, maybe you're telling a story. Those are reasons to make a game as well. But if the main activity of what the player is doing in the game is not interesting, then it's just not going to be enough. Again, if you're thinking of roguelike or roguelite as a genre, really all that does is define how the game plays over a series of sessions, right? There are randomized levels and permadeath. That doesn't really tell us what we're doing moment to moment. So you have this sort of situation. You know, the levels built themselves, what can you do in them? Jump, right? And this might seem like an exaggeration, but I often see people and they say, you know, I'm working on a roguelike. So they spend a lot of time focusing on the generation of things, and they haven't really solved what the player is doing moment to moment that is supposed to make the game fun. All of this is bringing us back to what I said at the beginning of, remember, a gamer has different reasons for putting things in a category to a designer. We might end up with the same categories and the same definitions of what is a cozy game or what is a roguelike or whatever. But as designers, we need to think a little bit more deeply about why these things we often refer to as game genres work. What the kind of main parts of them that make them work or make them appealing. And I've talked about this before in my video, Your Roguelikes Are Wrong, where again, people release games and they call them roguelikes, but they don't really nail the thing that people really enjoy about roguelikes, which is often the build variety rather than just randomized levels. Which is another example of why, as a game designer, you need to think of genres in a way that goes beyond just putting things in categories and starts to nail down the basics of what makes different genres appealing or what makes them work or not work. Spelunky is a great example of a game that nails what we would call a genre mashup. Nowadays, the idea of a platformer with procedurally generated levels is probably not that amazing, but when this game came out, it really was one of the first of its kind. And Derek Yu's Spelunky book has some excellent insights into this. Quick plug. I'm starting a new podcast this month that you will see pop up on the channel called The Game Developers Library. And this is the first book that myself and my guest are going to be covering on this podcast. We're going to take you through it and draw out some of the things that we think would be helpful for game developers to learn from. So if you're watching this and you're not subscribed to the channel and you want a kind of Cliff Notes version of a really, really good book about making indie games, then do subscribe to the channel and watch or listen to that when it comes up. So in the next set of quotes, Derek Yu talks about his reasons for putting platformer and roguelike together. I asked myself, what is it that I like about platformers? I'm a more action-oriented game player and I like how easy they are to pick up and play. I like the tension behind each jump. What didn't I like about platformers? I didn't like the repetitiveness of playing the same levels over and over and the reliance on memorizing level layouts to succeed. What did I like about roguelikes? I liked the variety that the randomly generated levels offer and how more meaningful death is in them. What didn't I like about roguelikes? I didn't like the repetitiveness of certain tasks that were required to succeed, like polypiling and the reliance on memorizing commands. You have to remember here that you is talking about old school roguelikes where it is like a top-down grid-based game. And what you see here is not just a developer putting two things together because he likes them. He's putting two things together that he likes and using the strengths of each one to try and counter or fix some of the problems with the other one. He's making a genre mashup in order to solve design problems rather than just because he likes these two things, so hey, let's put them together and hope that they work. So this is an example where something that we would think of as a genre mashup is not just a case of putting two things together to create novelty because they haven't been put together before. It is putting them together to help solve problems with each of those things. What is it about platformers that can help make a roguelike more interesting, and what is it about roguelikes that can help make a platformer better in some way? And I've put genre mashup in scare quotes here because in the model I'm trying to present to you today, platformer is the genre, but roguelike or roguelite is the mode. So think back to the pyramid from earlier. The platforming is the moment-to-moment thing we're actually doing in the game, and the roguelike thing is something we would only notice if we played the game for longer. It's to do with the overall structure of the game, right? So I would argue that the reason these things work so well together is because it's not actually putting two genres of games together. It is putting a platformer as the genre of the game, what you're doing moment to moment, and then using roguelite as a mode to structure the game and how it feels to play it over and over again, or how it feels to play a single session of it. So in the model I'm presenting, if you think back to the pyramid from earlier, the platformer mechanics are the base of that pyramid. They're the thing that you're doing moment to moment that you think is fun. If you only played Spelunky once, you would never know about the modal stuff. You would never know it was a roguelite. So all of this stuff is structural. It's about what it means to play Spelunky over and over again. And the platformer stuff is there to make sure it is fun. And if it's not fun, we don't care about this modal stuff. And remember, nothing in this video is about word policing. I'm not saying this to say, oh, you should never refer to rogue as a genre. You know, you should only ever think of genres as stuff like this. What I'm saying is, in the context of this game, what makes it successful as a mix of things is that each of these things is holding up a different section of that pyramid. More examples here of things that could be considered genre mashups, but when you actually realize that one of those genres is a mode rather than a genre, the game makes a lot more sense. Spelunky is a platformer in the roguelike mode. You are platforming and the game is a roguelike, which means that if you play it for a long time, you will notice structural differences to it compared to Mario, which looks like the same kind of game. It's a platformer, but it is not in the same structural mode. Then you've got Enter the Gungeon, which is a top-down action game or a twin-stick shooter, whatever you want to classify it as. You can tell that from looking at this picture that that is the type of game it is. You can see characters from a particular camera angle and they're shooting in directions. And then the roguelike again is the structure, right? Rogue Legacy 2 is an interesting example. It's another platformer, it's another roguelike platformer, but there is an option in this game to lock the layout of the castle. You can sort of pay some of your gold income to keep the castle in the same structure, and you can do that for as long as you want, at which point you've basically changed the mode of the game into a Metroidvania, because the castle becomes a big kind of set expanse for you to explore, and every time you die it's the same and you can just keep exploring it, right? So that is an example of a game that has a major mode of being a roguelike game, and then it has an optional mode of being a Metroidvania. Let's look at some more historical examples. If we think of the roguelike or roguelite, over here with the pink text, these are kind of classic roguelikes, and from these you could argue that in these cases, roguelike is a genre, right? We can look at these games, we immediately know what they are. But with some modern roguelikes and with roguelites, rogue has become the mode, because we look at these games and actually we see a platformer or a top-down action game, and the rogue elements are actually to do with the metagame progression of this game. When we talk about rogue-based games in general, we are talking about something that could be a genre or it could be a mode, right? And Caves of Khud is an interesting example. It's not on here, but that is a game that is generically like a roguelike, where it's this very ASCII art, looking down from above, turn-based movement type thing. But it actually has kind of different modes you can play it in, and you can even play it without the permadeath. Deck builders are another example. Now, when someone tells you they're making a digital deck builder, you tend to think of Slay the Spire and you think that someone is playing cards to complete some sort of task or some sort of battle, and then between rounds they build their deck. But that is an example of deck builder functioning as a mode, because what we're doing in a combat in Slay the Spire, what we're spending 80 or 90% of our time doing in this game is not building a deck of cards, it's using cards. Whereas these kind of traditional deck builders on the left are games where every turn of the game you are building your deck. So in this case, deck builder is the genre because it's what you're doing all the time in the game. But in these games on the right, like Slay the Spire and Loop Hero, you are playing a game and the long-term progression of that game is about building a deck. But the moment-to-moment gameplay isn't building a deck. If you want an example of a digital game, which I would put in the deck builder as genre category, then Party House from the UFO 50 collection is an example of that, because it's a game where you are building a deck of cards every turn you play. Now, I hope at this point, what I've said so far has helped you to understand why, as a game designer, this kind of stuff is important to understand. Now I'm going to go back over some of the common issues that you can avoid if you focus on the core genre of your game instead of the mood or mode, right? You focus on the bottom of the pyramid and you can think about the other layers of the pyramid, but you don't put loads of work into them until you've actually built the bottom of the pyramid. And from my perspective, these common issues are: number one, creating mashups without a good design reason. So the Derek Yu Spelunky example is a really good example of putting things together in a thoughtful way where you're actually trying to solve a design problem. You're not just putting things together because you like them and you haven't seen someone put them together, right? So the second one I've already alluded to, prematurely adding procedural generation systems, right? If you're making a roguelike, if it's a top-down shooter, if it's a platformer, whatever type of game it is, you do not need a level generator to make the game fun to play 100 times until you know that it is fun to play once. This is particularly important if you're a new developer, you're working on your first game or your first couple of games, you haven't really made anything you're super proud of yet. You don't want to be sinking months into making things like procedural level generators when you don't know that the actual game you're making is fun. This is building the middle of the pyramid when you haven't built the bottom yet. And this leads on to the next point, which is less to do with programming systems and more to do with making levels and other type of content like, you know, extra locations, extra enemies, extra weapons. This again is all tying into that middle section. If you decide to make a Metroidvania and you're like, I've got to make this big world, or you decide to make a Souls-like and that makes you think you've got to make all these levels and areas, but you haven't focused on the bottom of your pyramid, you're going to end up again wasting a lot of time churning out content that you don't need to do yet because you haven't proven that you've got an activity that people want to do more than once. And that applies to other types of content like stories and characters. Now, if you're making the type of game that is only stories and characters, like you're making a visual novel or something, then that is the base of your pyramid because interacting with characters is your game mechanic, right? But if you're adding story, dialogue, character interactions to a game that is meant to be a game about exploring or shooting or strategy or any of these things, you need to make sure that those things work because, again, all of this stuff is not foundational. It is not the bottom of the pyramid. Again, if we think back to this really strict definition of a genre being, you know, where is the camera? What is the character doing? How is the player controlling the character or the characters or the world in some way? None of that is none of that really requires there to be a story or characters or any of that stuff. That stuff is really important to have eventually. It can really kind of make your game different, give it a different appeal. It can help to explain particular things in the game, but it is not necessarily part of that genre base. And then the last one is starting a game based on mood. So that's things like cozy or horror, or mode, which is things like, you know, roguelike or deck builder or Vania or whatever, which you are not equipped to make in terms of technology or art. And what I mean here, if you haven't worked out what your core genre and your main mechanics of your game are, and instead you decide, I'm going to make a horror game or I'm going to make a cozy game, it may be that making a horror game or a cozy game is so dependent on you being able to do particular types of things as a programmer or an artist, that you just can't do it. If you start with mode and you start with something like roguelike or something that is to do with the structure of the game, again, you might end up with a bunch of challenges to do with your art or your programming, which you just can't do yet. And I think this bottom bullet point is particularly important if you're a new developer, because what you really need to do is make things and see what works and see what fun you are able to get out of your tools. Because there's no point setting out to make a platformer and then sitting down and finding out that actually you hate programming, making a little guy run around, right? There are other types of games you can make that do not require you to program or animate a little guy who runs around. Yet that's where so many people start, because they think, oh, that would be easy, I'll do one of those. Now the point here is, if you start at the bottom of the pyramid and you start with your core mechanics, you can quickly work out whether or not that is a game you want to make, because you will work out whether you have the required art skills or programming skills to make the core mechanics of the game. If you think back to the roguelike example, yeah, it's great to sit down and follow a bunch of tutorials on how to procedurally generate a dungeon. And then at the end of that, you're like, what do I do with this now? Oh, now I have to learn how to make a character move around and so on. If you always start with the basic mechanics, with the basic genre of what is the camera doing, what is the character doing, what is the player doing, then you're not going to back yourself into a corner where you suddenly need to do animations or you suddenly need to program features that are just going to be beyond what you can do at this moment. Now, I'm interested to see what you have to say about any of this, so leave your thoughts in the comments. If you've stayed all the way through this, then I would hope you have reasonable thoughts and you're not just going to moan about what genre you think Hollow Knight is or not, because if you're still feeling pedantic about putting things in particular genres, then perhaps you haven't got the point of this video, in which case I will work on expressing myself better next time. If you're new to this channel and you found this video helpful or insightful in some way, there are lots of other ways that I can potentially help you get better as a game developer. I do private coaching, I do design consulting where, you know, maybe someone's been working on a game for a while and they're a bit stuck with it and they want someone else to come in and redesign parts of it. And I also do a series called Indies Under the Knife, where every week I stream 4 games submitted by you guys and I give my feedback as a game designer. All of that, you can find out more about it on the Indie Game Clinic website, indiegameclinic.com. I also have a Patreon on patreon.com/indiegameclinic. Everyone who donates to that is helping to support this channel. I do make some money from YouTube, from AdSense, but it's not very much. So the Patreons are really the reason why I keep doing this. So if you found this video helpful, by all means, subscribe to the channel, go and watch some of the other videos. And if you find them helpful and you want more of this kind of content, please do support on Patreon. It's really helpful, goes a long way. The perks of supporting on the Patreon are that you get access to our Discord, which is an active community that has a very strong culture of very productive mutual feedback. And again, remember, I've been a university lecturer for games for 5 years. I've worked in the games industry for 10 years. I've done lots of different types of teaching and coaching. So this isn't just a random Discord community. It is like a virtual classroom that is aimed at intermediate to professional level game developers. And that's what you get access to by being part of our Patreon. I hope this video has helped you think of the concept of genre more like an analytical developer who wants to make good games and less like a nerdy gamer who just likes putting things in categories because it's fun.